Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. In a previous video, I introduced and reviewed the third Warlord of the Warlord cycle of war packs, Aun'shi, as well as his associated signature squad. But today we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the non-signature cards for each of our 7 base factions that were included within the Gift of the Ethereals war pack. Although by the time of making this video, we've seen the release of the Warlord cycle in its entirety, in addition to the Great Devourer Deluxe expansion, today I'm only going to be assessing and discussing the card combinations and synergy available when this war pack was first released, although I will share my benefit of significant foresight when it comes to analyzing each of these new cards' potential. Nevertheless, in later videos and while covering future expansions, rest assured I'll be revisiting each of these cards when appropriate to do so, the moment that new, powerful uses and combos become suddenly possible through the evolution and growth of our card pool. So, because I'm sure to miss or exclude some uses for these cards over the course of this video, be sure to mention your personal favorites and particularly clever, perhaps situational combos in the comments below. But with that said, let's get our review started. First up, we have 3 new Space Marines faction cards, beginning with the White Scars Bikers. They're a 3-cost army unit with 1 command icon, a base attack value of 2, as well as 3 hit points. They possess the Soldier and White Scars traits and read, this unit gets +2 attack while it is at a planet with a Warlord. So, upon initial assessment, this unit's printed statistics seem somewhat low relative to the cost. But if you manage to send this unit to a planet with a Warlord, either by deploying it or committing it alongside your own, or otherwise engaging that of the enemy, its attack value immediately increases to 4. So, at that point, for the same cost as an Honored Librarian, it attacks for the same value, is as effective during the command phase at netting you additional cards and resources, and, though it has no special damage or attack avoidance or mitigation ability, it does have a higher base pool of hit points. So, depending upon your expected opponent, one of those 2 units will generally be superior to the other. For instance, a Tzeentch's Firestorm will have a much more difficult time eliminating the White Scars Bikers than it would our aforementioned Librarian, and as an additional example, the White Scars Bikers require more than just a single gun drone's embedded area effect to volley in order to be destroyed. But, along those same lines, if you're interested in deploying the most durable 3-cost Space Marines unit possible, you may alternatively consider the Blood Angels Veterans. It doesn't pack quite as much punch as either other option, but can be remarkably more survivable, and for as alluring as high totals of attack power may be, if a unit cannot survive long enough to actually deal out a successful attack, then an infinite amount of attack power will be essentially wasted. But, frankly, a bit of the issue inherent to this unit lay strictly within its cost, because there are already so many other 3-cost Space Marines faction units. So, while this is another instance of a drop pod assault eligible Space Marine, and at that, one which potentially has an attack value of 4, you'll definitely want to put a strict limit on the number of 3-cost units included in your deck, especially if you're opting against running Captain Cato Sicarius, whose economic prowess vastly outclasses our Ragnar Blackmane alternative. But, considering too that this army unit is not loyal, although it is expensive to conventionally play, it can afford a tremendous amount of attack power to the Astra Militarum, and because activating this unit's attack value boost is as simple as deploying it to a planet where you fully intend to send your chosen warlord. Alongside Colonel Strachan, for instance, this soldier trait unit has a modified attack value of 5 and is an eligible target upon being destroyed for Elysian Assault Team. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention is that seldom is this unit seen allied with Tau, largely because despite the one lesser printed HP, the less expensive Borkon Recruits simply offers a slightly more appetitive cost curve. So, if you're looking for the most attack value per resource invested possible, you may want to look elsewhere. But if you're looking for a unit that manages to pack one hell of a punch, yet that still remains somewhat durable, then by all means, this may be the Space Marine faction option for you. But next, and somewhat unconventionally, we see a total of 2 Space Marines events, the first of which happens to be Crushing Blow. For a cost of 0, it has 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and reaction. After a Space Marine unit damages an enemy unit, deal 1 unpreventable damage to that unit. So, of paramount importance to consider in assessing this card is that once an SM unit manages to deal damage to any other unit, be it a token, army unit, or warlord, you can play this card entirely free of charge, which affords your opponent absolutely no opportunity to circumvent an additional point of damage, outside of outright canceling the effects of this event through Nullify. So, the general community consensus is that this is an exceptionally powerful card, and although not all Space Marine decks may run 3 copies of this event, it can nevertheless alter the outcome of a given battle dramatically. Generally, players naturally want to keep their units alive for as long as possible, and in order to do so, expend shield cards only when strictly necessary. What Crushing Blow allows you to do, however, is to punish an opponent for allowing even a single point of damage through. If you have an army unit with 2 hit points remaining and face an incoming attack valued at 2, it makes sense to use a 1 shield icon card instead of a 2 shield, because whether a unit has 1 HP or 10, so long as that unit isn't at 0 HP, it's able to contribute the same amount to both combat and command regardless. And if that same unit happens to possess the brutal keyword, then you'll definitely want to push the total number of damage tokens piled upon that unit to the greatest and riskiest heights possible. But the advent of Crushing Blow dramatically alters how opponents have to consider shielding against any damage dealt from a Space Marine source, because in that same 2 HP unit facing a 2 value attack type situation, if the defending player allows just a single point of damage through to be successfully dealt to the defending unit, the attacking player could trigger Crushing Blow after the attack damage is resolved, and since that event's damage is unpreventable, it affords your opponent no opportunity with which to salvage their unit. And critically important to consider is that you can play multiple copies of Crushing Blow, all as reactions off of the very same triggering event. So though it's statistically unlikely, it's entirely possible, albeit not probable, that you could play all 3 possible copies of Crushing Blow against the same target enemy, potentially resulting in an entirely unexpected unit kill or a warlord bloodying so outrageously unanticipated that it might just inspire and encourage your opponent to table flip. Granted, it's a bit of a shame that this non-loyal event only triggers off of damage dealt by Space Marines faction units, but it affords players an incredible opportunity to unexpectedly win win battles. In a sense, it's very similar, and in a way competes with, the Fury of Sicarius, because just like when facing that event, which threatens outright unit destruction, your opponent is going to have to carefully consider just how liberal they're comfortable being in regard to the discard of shield cards. And if your opponent is playing in fear of this event, and dreading the possibility of sudden, unpreventable damage in the back of their mind, then you could well get them to expend shield cards entirely unnecessary. And of course, every card discarded as a shield is one less event or one less attachment you need deal with conventionally. So the effect of this event may in some cases seem marginal, but it has the potential to cause enormous upsets and is, quite frankly, enormously powerful. And especially when you stop to consider that it can trigger off of the area effect volley of a daring assault squad or the 1 damage ping of a Sicarius' Chosen, the potential behind this ability is considerable. Upon initial release, Crushing Blow immediately became a Space Marine staple, and players have even had significant success playing it in SM Allied Tau and Astra Militarum. So I definitely can't encourage you enough to slot this one into your decks. It greatly increases the value of even the lowliest of Space Marine units, and even if you don't end up using it for its intended combat effects, it still serves perfectly well when discarded as shields. But last, we have our second Space Marines event and our third faction card, No Fear. With a cost of 1, a shield value of 1, and the tactic and maneuver traits, it reads Deploy action. Exhaust your Warlord to move up to 3 Space Marines faction army units from your HQ, each to a different planet. So this is a bit of a curious card. For the cost of 1, and for assuming the risk of committing your choice of Warlord during the command phase to a planet exhausted, you pick up to 3 SM army units at your HQ and place each of them at a different target planet. Note, importantly, that you can not send any of the maximum of 3 units to the same planet. So, playing this event could allow you an opportunity to win significant command. If you'd been pushing the first planet hard, perhaps, and wound up with a large number of SM units in your HQ, this could readily allow you to strategically redistribute them. Perhaps you want to send your Warlord to a faraway planet, yet don't want to deposit a large contingent of HQ resident units there. This allows you to split that group apart and potentially win command struggles on several different planets, or at least, perhaps just break even with your opponent's command presence. But the problem with that notion is that by playing this event, your Warlord ends up sent to a planet exhausted, which means he no longer wins a command struggle at his location by default. And though you could send your Warlord to a far distant planet, something like 5 or 4, although you will likely end up winning a battle ability, if perhaps entirely uncontested, without actually possessing any additional command icons at that planet, your exhausted Warlord will not win a command struggle alone. Plus, any time that your Warlord is exhausted, and keep in mind he'll stay that way until the end of the first combat round, he's extraordinarily vulnerable to being picked apart by enemy units. For instance, if you split up your more combat-capable units that had been swept into your HQ, hoping perhaps to protect some of your strictly economy units from the likes of the location-shifting ethereal Aun'shi, you also run the risk of your Warlord being beaten and bloodied by various card effects. For instance, while you might save some of your command units from being sniped thanks to that strategic redistribution, an exhausted SM Warlord would be the perfect target for an ennui prelate to be ambushed into play, only to hit you for 4. And similarly, a timely Gift of Isha, Drop Pod Assault, or any number of other ambush-style combat effects could all serve to dish out copious amounts of punishment to any SM player audacious and bold enough to attempt to benefit from this event. I think perhaps its best case for use may be to allow the SM player a bit of strategic adaptation. For example, to shift from a very aggressive Planet 1 focused playstyle to something more controlling and long-term. But all the same, I'm still not sure that I'm convinced to run this event. I like that because it's a deploy action, you move your units to different planets without their becoming exhausted, which leaves them ready to attack during the first round of combat, and as a rule of thumb, SM units are generally both powerful and durable, and if there were any units formidable enough to stand on their own, in most cases, Space Marines tend not to disappoint. But I don't like that you exhaust your Warlord to trigger this effect, and I don't like that you often won't have 3 SM units in your HQ, because of course, this does not affect either neutral or allied units. So, though Space Marines players generally run light on allied armies, I still think it may not be often that you get the maximal benefit from this ability. I think it could be a decent event if you're afraid of encountering an enemy that plays Doom, but then again, if you do try to escape certain HQ destruction through playing this event, it's also worth considering that Eldar, at least, do have the option of Nullify. So, altogether, I'm just still not convinced. To me, it seems a fair bit of risk for a fairly marginal gain. I could certainly stand to be convinced otherwise in time, but for now, consider me quite dubious. Still, with our Space Marines faction now covered, on to the Astra Militarum, a faction for which we also see 3 new additions. First, we have the Mystic Warden, a 0-cost army unit with 0 command icons, an attack value of 2, and a pool of 2 hit points. It has the Psyker trait and forced reaction. After a battle at this planet ends, sacrifice this unit. So this is certainly the most powerful of the 0-cost units which we've seen printed thus far. Unlike the 1-attack, 1-HP Penal Legionnaire and Sniveling Grot, this unit does not succumb to the likes of Area Effect 1 or any incidental instance of damage. Granted, it does end up sacrificed at the end of any battle in which it participates, but along those same lines, it may end up being destroyed anyways. Overall, I find this to be an intriguing card. It doesn't necessarily combo with existing AM synergy because note that it possesses no soldier trait, and though it does leave play naturally, it does so at the end of a battle, which, under almost any circumstance, provides its controller with no synergistic benefit. This unit possesses no command icons, and of course it has no associated shields, and unlike the also generally free Elysian Assault Team, which similarly attacks for 2, this army unit is slower in a sense, because it needs to be played well in advance of an opponent's actions, and is therefore clearly telegraphed, as opposed to simply responding to an opponent's choices and potentially altering the outcome of battle when your enemy exhibits a moment of weakness. Before long, we will see an AM support that allows units like this one to be the equivalent of ambushed into play, so it will stand to become significantly better at that point, but even as is, I could see the Mystic Warden working reasonably well in an AM deck that runs heavy on command. If you're drawing a large volume of cards, perhaps with the assistance of units like the Interrogator Acolyte, free but nevertheless relatively powerful units like this one can certainly help you to flood the board with competent combat units, and with them, potentially overwhelm your opponent. I just think it's important to always consider that this is indeed a fairly slow card. It could work reasonably well when used in conjunction with Noble Deed, that is, you attack for 2 and then sacrifice this unit to deal an additional 2 points of damage, albeit that's only to a target enemy army unit. So, perhaps in time this will rise to see more prominent play, potentially as we see the development of possible Psyker synergy, but for now, I'm not overly impressed with our Warden. But next we see an AM attachment, the Honorifica Imperialis. For the cost of 2 resources, it has 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, and the war gear and award traits. It reads, attached to an army unit. While at a planet with an enemy warlord, attached unit gains armor, bane, and ranged. So this card is by no means inexpensive, but if it just so happens you don't opt to opportunistically play it, it does still offer 2 associated shields, which itself is something somewhat seldom seen, and therefore any such card is never worth carelessly dismissing. Under ideal circumstances, this attachment dramatically increases the likelihood of a successful warlord assassination, because once affixed to a unit, if that unit ends up at the same planet as an enemy warlord during the ranged skirmish round, before the enemy warlord has their opportunity to retreat, the attached unit can fire a single armor bane ranged attack that outright denies an opponent their ability to shield. But unfortunately, this is a card very limited in utility, because if you aren't able to arrange for the attached unit to be at the same planet as the enemy warlord, then this 2-cost attachment confers no beneficial ability. Plus, I think it's certainly worth considering that Astra Militarum faction players sometimes struggle to attain a significant attack value. Granted, a copy of White Scar's Bikers alongside Colonel Strachan could make use of this attachment to attack for 5 armor bane during the ranged skirmish round, but that's 5 resources spent across 2 total cards, and in general most frequently seen AM units have nowhere near that kind of attack power. And despite the existence of the ubiquitous Catachan outpost, what makes this bargain still worse is just how easily countered individual army units are. Convenient routing effects like Archon's Terror will instantly dash your best laid of plans, as can enemy exhausting effects like Eldorath's Starbane. And note that though armor bane damage cannot be shielded against, it can still be outright prevented, so both Indomitable and Custom Field Generator also serve to damper this frankly lackluster attachment. What this card can potentially do is discourage your opponent's warlord from being commit to a specific planet, but all the same, it's a big investment of resources for a very limited and by no means insurmountable effect. Dependent upon faction, your opponent may even possess a ranged keyword unit of their own, and even if they have the initiative token, they could well kill your unit prior to your opportunity to attack, and your attached unit could certainly fall prey to any number of direct damage events or enemy unit relocation cards, such as Sicarius's Chosen or even Deception. So, it sounds great in theory, but in practice, I think that unfortunately, the Honorifica Imperialis may serve to prove somewhat of a disappointment. All the same, third and last of our Imperial Guard cards, we have 2 arms. It is a 0-cost event, which also has 2 shield icons. It has a loyal icon and the tactic trait. It reads Action, ready a target support card. So this is an intriguing event, and one prone to causing stupendous upsets, whether it's preventing one of your units from being destroyed thanks to its shield value of 2, or otherwise if it affords you to use one of your powerful supports an unexpected additional time. What I like most about this card is that it has essentially limitless potential. Each and every time we see a new Astra Militarum, Space Marines, or Orc faction support, the savvy AM player must reassess whether it's worth playing this event. Plus, because this can be used to target any support, it has significant and will only ever have increasing amounts of versatility. But most conventionally, I think this event is likely to be used in an offensive sense. If you have a Catachan outpost, instead of just giving a single unit +2 attack value, you can play 2 arms, ready the outpost, exhaust it again, and give a target unit an additional 2, although as always that effect only persists for its next individual attack. But you could also use this on an orc cannon to fire an additional time, or in the most desperate of times, you could use it on an upcoming orc support in order to dig as deep as possible through your deck in order to discover potentially game-changing or salvaging cards. And although I think it's extraordinarily unlikely, I think it's entirely possible that, perhaps in the most dire of circumstances, you could use this on your own Imperial Bunker, the one-cost AM-specific army unit resource cost reducing support in order to ensure that you have the required number of resources to play whatever pivotal, potentially game-altering cards you may need while maximizing the number of your units deployed to the battlefield. So most definitely powerful and positioned only to improve with time, and considering in general the monumental power behind many signature supports in particular, whenever we receive a new Astra Militarum Warlord whose support requires exhaustion, then 2 arms could quickly go from a great card to being one truly incredible. However, with Astra Militarum now thoroughly covered, we're on to the Orcs. They too receive 3 new cards, and quite similar to the event which we just discussed, let's begin with the army unit MCK Repair Crew. It has a cost of 3, 1 command icon, a loyal icon, and an attack value of 2. It has 3 hit points, the Odd Boy trait, and action. Exhaust this unit to ready a target Orc support card you control, then deal 1 damage to this unit. So, for better or worse, this unit's stats seem weak relative to the cost. Although a moderate pool of HP does afford it some opportunity to benefit from the brutal keyword when played alongside Nozdreg, this unit nevertheless strikes me as a little too expensive to be used primarily as an attacker. And considering it's another instance of a low command icon value orc unit, I can't imagine running this unit unless you're explicitly intending to benefit from its ability, which is to ready an orc faction-specific support card you control, though doing so comes at the expense of incurring 1 damage. So, given that Nozdreg was the only available Orc Warlord at the time of this Warpack's release, it isn't necessarily a bad thing to take damage. But, considering that this action means that the MCK Repair Crew must itself be exhausted, that, combined with taking a point of damage, makes it rather likely to end up being destroyed by your enemy. And, though 2 arms seems more versatile and far less expensive for the same ultimate effect, both of these cards are loyal to their respective faction, and therefore the MCK Repair Crew is unique in affording Orc players specifically the option of using a single in-faction support potentially multiple times. So, let's say for instance you're interested in Orc Cannon. Under usual circumstances, you exhaust that support, pick a planet, and both you and your opponent are forced to each deal 1 indirect damage among your units at that planet. And ideally, you either outright benefit from taking that damage, or otherwise you simply don't have any units present, and then in that case, it's only damaging your enemy. So, if it just so happens that the MCK Repair Crew doesn't see combat, if it's sitting at a planet where a battle is clearly not going to take place, you can nevertheless trigger its action in order to squeeze an additional use out of any one of your supports. Or, if the MCK is embroiled in combat, if you need not actually attack with it, bear in mind that at the end of each combat round it readies like any other unit, and there is no limit to the number of times per round or phase you can activate this action. So, though the Mechaniac does deal itself damage each and every time it activates its ability, you could potentially activate the same lone support repeatedly, and if it's something like an Orc cannon that you're targeting, then that combo could afford you the opportunity to wipe out innumerable squishy enemy economy units, or perhaps opportunistically take out some of their vulnerable combat units. Either your opponent must freely spend shield cards, or you can kill Void Pirates, Bealtan Guardians, and Vashia Trailblazers in possible droves. Plus, I think it's of paramount importance to consider that the damage incurred by the Repair Crew's action is not a cost. After the ability resolves, you deal 1 damage to your own unit, which means that it's entirely shieldable. Just keep in mind that with that pool of a mere 3 hit points, by no means can you trigger this action indiscriminately. I do like that you can use this action during any phase of the game, although it's definitely worth mentioning that many supports are in fact specific phase exclusive, and I also like that the Mechaniac also synergizes with various other effects, such as the Orc readying Smash and Bash. It's just critical that you weigh carefully just how many cards, resources, and shields you end up investing in what could prove to be an enormously cost-ineffective Mechaniac. So, unfortunately, this is not a unit that often sees play, but again, as we see the advent and creation of more Orc supports, it's nevertheless something that will always warrant constant reassessment, and certainly, as we soon explore a powerful new Orc support in this very video, I definitely suggest you consider the possibilities intrinsic to our Repair Crew. But before we get to that support, let's first cover an attachment, another facsimile of an Astra Militarum card included within this very same war pack. We see the Goth Big Choppa. For the cost of 2, it has a shield value of 1 and the war gear and weapon traits. It reads, attached to an army unit. Attached unit gets +2 attack and armor bane. So notably, this attachment is not loyal and therefore affords Astra Militarum players additional options. If they find Honorifica Imperialis too situational and are often unable to pin down the enemy Warlord, this attachment suffers no such restriction. You simply affix it to a unit and it immediately stands to derive benefit. But despite the allure of additional attack value and the possible devastation afforded by armor bane, all the same risks apply as before. Dependent upon both the faction you're playing and are up against, individual army units can be outright trivial to counter, and though a +2 attack bonus is definitely significant, in many cases it can be a bit of overkill, simply owing to the rather low cost curve of our meta at the time of this war pack's release, and the associated generally low HP values we logically see on most units. Granted, this can make specific units of yours enormously dangerous. For instance, a Rattling Deadeye is immediately augmented to a 3-attack armor bane and ranged keyword unit, but that very same army is extraordinarily vulnerable to being destroyed by myriad different card effects, and while this attachment costs the exact same as a Catachan outpost, it's limited to only ever benefiting 1 unit, as opposed to something far more flexible like that support. And while it does additionally confer the armor bane keyword to the attached unit, it cannot be equipped by tokens or by your Warlord, and attachments are in general far easier to remove from play than supports. And plus, the instant that the attached unit is exhausted, whether by suppressive fire or Eldorath Starbane, or simply by being swept up into one's Warlord retinue, that same unit may end up being destroyed prior to it having a chance to attack more than at most a handful of times. So, like I said before, armor bane can be great, and the Big Choppa can be fantastic in discouraging your opponent from sending their Warlord to a target planet. And whether you hold the initiative or simply affix this to a ranged unit, this could be tremendously powerful. But I do hesitate to add this to decks based upon the cost relative to what other options Orc players are afforded. And for Chaos, consider considering just how high their cost curve already is, and how high the attack values are of various demons, the Goth Big Choppa just seems like an unnecessary inclusion. All the same, and last but by no means least, we have the Ammo Depot, a 1-cost orc support with the location trait and text action. Exhaust this support to draw 1 card if you have 3 or fewer cards in hand. So, this is a straightforward, incredible card. It costs next to nothing and provides unrivaled card advantage. If you're filling the revealed planets with low-cost units, you're quite likely to reach 3 or fewer cards in hand quickly, and this support allows you to keep that momentum from halting. Of paramount importance to consider is that this effect is an action. So, if during combat you end up depleting your hand due to shielding, you can freely exhaust this support in order to draw additional cards. You might end up with additional combat tricks, and you may well draw more shield cards. Plus, this support is not unique, it's not limited, and therefore you're entirely free to play multiple copies. You just need to be wary of choking yourself by running a deck that's too full of supports. But still better, if you use this support during the deploy phase, it affords you a fantastic opportunity to stall out your opponent and increase the likelihood that they pass. And in conjunction with any number of other effects, that Ammo Depot deploy stall could be impeccable in forcing your opponent to pass early, which then allows you free reign to proceed to distribute your army units as favorably about the Traxxas sector as is possible. For instance, let's consider this deploy stall example. You play a copy of Ammo Depot, you exhaust that copy of Ammo Depot, you trigger MCK Repair Crew to ready your Ammo Depot, and then you either play a card or again trigger the Ammo Depot. You've spent hardly any resources but taken a tremendous number of actions, and then you proceed to play out that turn's worth of units. For any faction that can take this support, it can provide spectacular benefit. Zerathor can draw more game-changing events and direct damage effects, and Colonel Strachan can reap a wealth of cheap additional units, shields, and his own smattering of combat tricks. So, if you can run Ammo Depot, I wholeheartedly recommend that you do so, but if you decide to run 3 copies of this support, you may need mentally prepare yourself for the occasional feel-bad, self-inflicted card choke. Still, now that we've completed our assessment of orcs, let us dissolve into Chaos, a faction for which we see 3 new cards, beginning with one of my personal favorite army units, the Rotten Plaguebearers. For a cost of 2, they have 1 command icon, an attack value of 0, as well as 2 hit points. They possess the Demon and Nurgle traits and read action. Exhaust this unit to deal 1 damage to a target unit at this planet. So, perhaps deceptively inoffensive at first, this is an exceptionally dangerous unit. Keep in mind that because there are action windows during the combat phase which occur prior to any battles taking place, this action can therefore be triggered before any ranged skirmish round. So, you could potentially pick off your enemy's ranged units, or with or without the assistance of any number of other Chaos faction direct damage effects, otherwise destroy that which poses the greatest immediate threat to you. Plus, consider that though 1 damage itself may seem outright insignificant, this unit is superb alongside Zerathor, because as soon as he happens to be present at the Plaguebearers planet, that single point of damage is immediately augmented to an assignment of 2, which threatens to destroy a wide swath of units. Even better, this action is not an attack, so therefore the 2 HP Honored Librarian is a perfect target for this ability, and you're free to target any unit with this effect, so the opponent's tokens and Warlord are just as eligible to be targeted as the rest of their army. And again, because you can trigger this action prior to battle, that means you can ping your opponent with damage before the enemy has an opportunity to retreat, and although your opponent opponent is unlikely to send their Warlord headlong into battle where they're clearly in jeopardy of being bloodied, it is entirely possible that Zerathur could use an Infernal Gateway to drop this unit into play, and then ignore initiative by triggering this action in order to immediately, potentially bloody your enemy. Even better, perhaps, is that if a battle is not going to occur at the Plaguebearers planet, they still have the opportunity to trigger that effect. And it's definitely worth noting that triggering that ability does not consume a combat turn, so the more Plaguebearers you have, the better. And as soon as a combat round does come to a close at their planet, each and every copy of Plaguebearers that suddenly readies, if your opponent decides not to retreat their entire army, will get to fire another single target, ideally 2 damage volley, as an action before either player ends up taking their first combat turn of that second combat round. Also worth noting is that this ability is an any phase action, and therefore it can occur during the deploy phase. So, in doing so, not only does it consume a deploy action, helping encourage your opponent to pass, but it can also remove problematic units from play either prior to their attempt to elude you, such as killing a Vashia Trailblazer before it can use mobile to reposition itself to safety, or you might be able to kill an enemy unit with a dangerous ability that occurs at the beginning of combat, like we'll see from an elite Chaos Demon in an upcoming war pack. And, though it comes at a bit of a risk in attempting to do so, this unit could also help you win additional command struggles. For instance, if you have the Rotten Plaguebearers and another 1 command icon unit sitting at a planet opposite something along the lines of an enemy recon drones, you could risk triggering this action, and either your opponent shields and is then positioned to win command because your Plaguebearers would now be exhausted and would no longer contribute their command icon, or your opponent instead does not or cannot shield, and their unit is destroyed, and you've moved from breaking even to suddenly winning that upcoming command struggle. So, frankly, I can't see what's not to like about this unit. It isn't quite so powerful when used outside of a Zerathur deck, but therein it's incredible. So, I cannot recommend this unit enough. In conjunction with Orc Cannon and innumerable direct damage chaos effects, it just seems irreplaceable and enormously useful. However, next we see a far less conventional card. We have Throne of Vainglory, a 3-cost support with a loyal icon and the upgrade and Slaanesh traits. It reads Action. Exhaust this support to discard the top card of your deck. If the printed cost of the discarded card is 3 or higher, put 2 cultist tokens into play at your HQ. So, once you pay for this support 1 time per round, you can simply exhaust it, and it could be as if you just played a Promise of Glory, because you might suddenly have 2 cultist tokens sitting in your HQ. They could be used to attack, because alongside Zerathur they will be attacking for 2, but as with any unit commit to a planet alongside one's Warlord, they'll show up exhausted, and with 1 HP they'll be of trivial difficulty to destroy. So probably the best use for those tokens is to sacrifice them, which allows you to decrease the cost of subsequently played demon trait units. 2 cultists sacrificed means that you can lower the cost of any 1 demon by 2, or 2 demons by 1. So, under ideal conditions, once you play Throne of Vainglory, it'll generate you the equivalent of 2 additional resources each and every round. So, in a sense, the earlier you play it, the better. But if you play it early, 3 is a significant number of resources to invest in a support, because unlike if you were to instead spend those resources investing in army units, this card will neither contest your opponent's command struggles or win you any of your own. And of course, it has absolutely no value during combat unless you intend to eventually bring those tokens to battle. But the problem with Throne of Vainglory is that often it won't be functioning optimally. If the card you end up discarding from the top of your deck is 2 cost or lower, you simply will not generate any cultist tokens that round. And plus, consider that whether you manage to create 2 tokens or not, you're still required to discard a card, which could potentially be one of the very demons you were hoping to draw and subsequently sacrifice your tokens to put into play. Even though the Chaos faction tends to run a higher cost curve than many others, I still don't like how often the support could fail to generate tokens, and for such a big investment of resources, I'd rather not pay for such an inconsistent effect. Plus, considering that our current meta values low cost but high efficiency units, at this point in time the support seems very unfavorable. Seeing as how it costs 3 resources and a card, it takes at least 2 successful activations before you break approximately even economically due to generating the approximate equivalent of 4 resources over 2 rounds, and only when it triggers a 3rd time do you start to see and feel any appreciable profit. But considering just how much that investment could set you back in the early game in regard to loss of tempo, unless you're playing a very long game of Conquest, which is something statistically unlikely, I just don't see the support paying off over time. This is not only an inconsistent card, but still worse, it's very slow to potentially generate profit. Plus, if you want to build a deck that may actually possess a reasonable chance of benefiting upon your triggering Throne of Vainglory, you need to include a wealth of medium to high cost cards. But again, if by some poor misfortune you end up discarding the most desirable of those, perhaps all the additional tokens spawned by this support will end up with no ultimate reason to exist. Without any formidable demons to actually use them with which to put into play, perhaps a high cultist unit count will simply serve to make you less likely to activate Taurus, or even equate to your serving up resources in mass to an opponent playing Captain Cato Sicarius. I do like that this support's ability being an action does provide you with a bit of deploy stall, and later, near the end of the Warlord cycle, we end up seeing a bit more development of cultist trait synergy beyond just the regenerating core set Ravenous Fleshhounds elite, but for the time being, this resource equivalent cultist token engine is just a bit too unreliable and overall underwhelming to be considered worthy of including in almost any deck. If there comes a day when running nearly all 3+ cost cards in a deck does become possible or even advisable, then maybe Throne of Vainglory may be worth giving a second appraisal, but for now, I think this Chaos support can, unfortunately, quite safely be relegated to the binder. All the same, to round out our trio of new Chaos options, we have an event, the 3-cost Nerdling Bomb. It has 1 shield icon and the tactic and Nurgle traits. It reads combat action, target a planet. For each non-Nurgle unit at that planet, its controller must choose to either deal 1 damage to it or rout it. So, quite clearly, this provides an adaptable Chaos player an alternative or supplement to Warp Storm. Instead of dealing 2 damage to all units without attachments at a target planet, you instead force all non-Nurgle units to make a difficult choice. They either take 1 point of damage, which could potentially be 2 if augmented by Zerathir, or they're immediately routed. So, although this card effect may not always kill units, it can be just as effective as Warp Storm when it comes to removing units from planets. And in fact, if you are up against units laden and equipped with a variety of different attachments, it can even prove more effective than Warp Storm, because attachments do nothing to provide immunity or resistance to this event. Plus, this card has quite a bit of built-in versatility in that it can be used in both an offensive and defensive sense. If you want to retreat your Warlord but don't want to do so without inflicting considerable damage to your enemy, play Nerdling Bomb at the same planet as Zarather and allow him to be routed. Your opponent's units are either assigned 2 points of damage or they're routed, and depending on what you have left at the planet, your lingering units might be able to mop up the enemy remainder easily. If you have a large number of Nurgle trait units, it's entirely possible you could easily overwhelm that which your opponent has left, and even if you don't, you could either damage some of your units, like the brutal keyword possessing Khorne Berserkers, or, if you'd rather not take damage, then simply allow some of your own units to instead be routed, especially if you're fighting at Planet 1 and you feel confident in being able to win that battle, because those very same routed units would end up in your HQ anyways, and if you won't benefit from their taking damage, then under most circumstances, there's probably no reason to end up endangering them unnecessarily. Or, even if you played Nurgling Bomb at a planet further away than 1, if you want to relocate some of your present units for combat the following round, you can simply allow them to be routed to enter your HQ, and then, during the subsequent turn, they'll just move alongside your Warlord to be deposited wherever you want them. This event is spectacular against not just low HP units, but also those with the ranged keyword or any action which requires exhaustion, because whether your opponent takes damage or simply lets their units be routed, you can certainly benefit from both. This event can even help constrict your opponent's choice for where to commit their Warlord the following round if you force them to fill their HQ with units. And of course, exhausted units certainly make for far more vulnerable targets than ready units otherwise are. Plus, if you do happen to run this event alongside and in conjunction with the likes of a Warp Storm, what better opportunity than to target and bombard your opponent's HQ? So, this affords Chaos players an interesting few options when it comes to global effect events. It provides a bit of a detriment to non-Nurgle units, but even then, isn't without some unique upsides that Nurgle trait units miss out on, such as manipulating that brutal keyword, or affording even your already exhausted Warlord the opportunity to retreat. So, at the time of this card's release, it immediately became fantastic as a means to help Kugoth bully planets aggressively, and as soon as we see a Nurgle elite army unit that triggers planet-wide damage upon the onset of the combat phase, this event can provide your enemy with a very difficult number of choices indeed. This is a great response to the other players' events, such as Preemptive Barrage, and it provides a fantastic opportunity to punish your opponent with Kugoth's Nurglings, because if you can force them to move a large number of units from their HQ to one likely decisive planet, the damage inflicted by one or more copies of your Nurglings can add up considerably. So, in summation, this is a relatively superb little event, and something I definitely encourage any prospective Chaos player to try. But now that we've covered our Chaos faction, we're on to our Dark Eldar, a faction for which we see 2 new additions. First up, we have a card that has garnered immense popularity since its inception, the Slith Mercenary. For 1 resource, it has 2 command icons, an attack value of 2, and also 2 hit points. It has the Warrior trait and action. Pay 2 resources to take control of this unit if it is at a planet. Any player may use this ability. So, this is a card that exhibits incredible value. For a single resource, you get a competent, flexible unit that will survive incidental damage, such as that from an orc cannon, and it conveniently allows for you to trump an enemy's 1 command icon unit. Even if it isn't possible to overcome your opponent's command, this unit can often make breaking even trivial in difficulty. and if it makes it to combat, 2 damage is certainly nothing to balk at. Considering also that this card isn't loyal, it could also make a pretty fantastic ally for Eldar in helping them to control the command phase all the more than they were already able to. But the major complicating factor to this unit is that it can be bribed. Although Dark Eldar generally attempt to either choke their opponent of cards or otherwise starve them of resources, if you allow your opponent the opportunity to purchase this unit, they could immediately flip your command phase advantage against you. You could easily go from winning a command struggle to losing for the cost of a mere 2 resources, and considering that cards are generally more valuable than an equivalent number of resources, if your opponent simply purchases this unit from you, they're generally coming out ahead in regard to investment versus unit value. But that same bribe action does allow for several interesting possibilities. For instance, if you convince your opponent to expend resources needlessly, you serve to limit some of their other options. Or if you get involved in a bidding war for this unit, where you and your opponent repeatedly purchase the Slith mercenary from one another, you effectively shrink and confine the present game state. And if at that point you're already in an advantaged position, you make it all the less likely your opponent can afford to purchase the things they need to contest and attempt to overcome you. Another advantage is that if your opponent purchases this unit, then they're only effectively using those resources to concentrate units on one planet, instead of spreading additional deployed units among several, which means that by merit of their purchasing this unit, they could potentially be inadvertently foregoing winning multiple other command struggles just so they can manage to best you at one individual planet. But I think if at any point you're considering playing this unit, you need to mind your action windows carefully, and clearly often the best time to deploy this unit is after your opponent has passed during the deploy phase, because at that point they've forgone all opportunities to take actions for the remainder of that phase, and because there are no additional action windows until after all command struggles are resolved, the Slith mercenary can easily allow you some last-minute deploy phase positioning in order to reel in a wealth of resources and cards. And consider also that buying control of a mercenary counts as a deploy action, which contributes to stall. So, overall, this strikes me as a fascinating card. When drawn and played early, it can contribute to creating a very powerful economy. But if your opponent ends up with an adequate number of resources with which to purchase this unit from you, then you do fare worse in regard to invested value. Definitely be mindful that when going into combat, any player could use one action to bribe these mercenaries, and then, if their opponent can't respond in kind, they'll be the player able to attack their enemy for an additional 2. So, while in the worst of cases this unit may end up proving to be a bit of an asset to your opponent, at the very least, hopefully you're able to use this unit to at least once block off an opponent's desperately desired income. Even if this unit ends up being bought by your enemy, it could nevertheless serve to deprive them of the same cards or resources they're in desperate need of, hopefully during a pivotal round of the game. You could even deploy this unit alone to planet number 1, or affix an attachment to it if you're in particular want of convincing your enemy to whittle away their ideally dwindling resources. So, certainly a card that rewards talented play, but by no means not one without significant risk. Safest deployed late and when at a resource advantage, but certainly not without myriad additional uses. Altogether, an exceptionally powerful instrument in the Dark Eldar arsenal, but definitely not one to deploy thoughtlessly. Still, second and last of our Dark Eldar cards, we have an event, namely Despise, with a cost of 0, 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and combat action. Each player must sacrifice an allied trait unit he controls if able. So, under ideal conditions, for no cost apart from a card, you force your opponent to forego an already paid for ally, while you suffer no detriment yourself. If one of your opponent's first deploy actions is something like a Void Pirate, or more valuably, an Eldar Survivalist, during that round's combat phase, you can respond with Despise, and that's probably the best case use for this event. If you have no allies, you give up nothing yourself, and your opponent is down maybe 1 unit. But note that you did invest a card to remove that unit, only to come ahead by 1 or maybe 2 resources, if you're strictly comparing the cost of Despise to your opponent's sacrificed ally. Granted, your opponent may end up losing a unit with an associated attachment, but seeing as how each player chooses which unit to sacrifice, apart from their having 1 fewer unit on the table, this may not actually hinder your opponent, because particularly during the mid and late game, they could just sacrifice an ally at a planet where they are not going to be winning command the following round anyways. And on the topic of the command phase, note that this event is a combat action, and that therefore the enemy ally trait unit will have already had at least 1 opportunity with which to contribute to your opponent's command. And unless you don't play any ally trait units yourself, many of which see frequent play because they're quite clearly powerful economy and utility units, then you also serve to set yourself back with this event. Though a fair few ally trait units are very popular, allies in general are few and far between, and with only 1 2-cost core set exception in the Eldar Survivalist, note a unit which seldom sees play, the overwhelming majority of allies cost 1 resource at most, though at least, with scarcely few exceptions, none of the 0-cost allies are played. Still worse, however, is that many of the ally trait units have beneficial effects that trigger upon their entering play, such as the Earthcast Technician. So, by the time you can play Despise to force that unit to be sacrificed, the Technician's deployer has already had the opportunity to search for a drone or attachment. Notably, both Rogue Trader and Void Pirate are immensely popular units, and both possess the ally trait, but you're probably just as likely as is your enemy to be running either of both of those allies yourself, and by opting not to play one, were you to have one in hand, you may well be costing yourself a small amount of tempo advantage relative to your opponent. So, altogether, Despise strikes me as a very curious card. It could help increase the likelihood of the mandatory army unit sacrificed by Power from Pain ending up to be devastating, but this event is in almost every circumstance woefully underwhelming. Perhaps there may come a day when we reconsider Despise, maybe if we ever start to see certain factions play rather expensive ally units, but considering that ally seems to be the trait associated with low-cost utility cards, and that elite is instead the trait bestowed upon expensive military units, I can't see any situation, especially sometime soon, in which Despise is at all worth considering for deck inclusion. But last of our factions to discuss, we happen to have the Eldar, a faction which picks up 3 new deck options, including 2 different army units. First of these, we have the Eldritch Corsair, the Eldar version of a series of units that all stand to become more powerful when a Warlord is present. For a cost of 3 resources, it has 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, a pool of 3 hit points, and the Warrior and Iyanden traits. It reads, this unit gets +2 attack while it is at a planet with a Warlord. So, more often than not, this unit will be a 4/3, whether alongside your own Warlord or simply standing in opposition of that of your enemy. For a not insignificant expense, you're nevertheless purchasing a rather hard-hitting and resilient platform of a unit. The Eldritch Corsair may be expensive, but it will contribute to command, and although it's more costly than similar units like the Borkon Recruits, it is significantly more hard party, making it more likely to survive long enough to actually engage in a successful attack. But the problem with the Corsair is that Eldar players are afforded the luxury of options. Consider that for the same resource investment but one fewer HP, they could instead invest in an Iyanden Wraithguard, which has a printed 4 attack value and Armor Bane, the keyword which disallows an opponent their opportunity to shield. Or, if a player just wants to purchase as much attack value per resource as possible, then again, I suggest they look back to those aforementioned 4 attack, 2 resource Borkon recruits. And frankly, I think that's part of the problem with this unit. For a resource cost of 3, it significantly increases the cost curve of a deck. Eldorath already has 3 cost signature army units, and especially compared to the Eldar unit I'll move on to cover in a couple of minutes, I frankly can't see Packmaster Kith, for instance, being willing to make this investment. Commander Shadowsun certainly appreciates a formidable body upon which to affix her attachments, but then again, the more resources a player invests all into one unit, the more likely they are to set themselves up for heartbreak upon one timely rout or piece of removal. So, overall, I find the Eldritch Corsair entirely acceptable, and certainly a fine target for recursion through Gift of Isha, as well as augmentation via Empower, but until we see more resource acceleration, cost reduction effects, or perhaps upcoming warrior trait synergy, I think that our current meta, in placing the utmost value on cheap as efficient as possible per resource cost units, simply wins out on this one. All the same, let's compare our Eldritch Corsair to this war pack's second Eldar faction army unit, the Warlock Destructor, which has become a ubiquitous card. For the cost of 2 resources, it has 1 command icon, an attack value of 3, and 4 associated hit points. It possesses the Psyker trait and Forced Reaction. After the deploy phase begins, pay 1 resource token or discard this unit. So this is an incredible card. For only 2 resources, it has the same attack value commonly found printed upon 3 cost units, and has even more hit points than average. It's therefore extraordinarily durable and hits exceptionally hard, and unlike our last war pack's equivalently cost Black Guardians, the Warlock Destructor also has the capability of contributing to you during the command phase. But this unit does possess one clear, immediately evident drawback. Should it exist at the beginning of a deploy phase, you're presented with a choice. You can pay 1 resource, or you can discard this unit. However, consider that if you deploy this unit and it ends up being slain during combat, then you need not be bothered by such a decision, and for the cost, this army unit provides exceptional value. If you play it at the first planet, for instance, it's difficult to remove, deals out significant amounts of combat damage, and can convince your opponent to potentially skip that battle entirely. You might be able to activate a desirable battle ability at that location, and then, once this unit has entered your HQ, you can simply decide during the following round if you'd rather it be discarded or instead it be preserved, based upon your total number of resources and the presenting conditions of the battlefield. Still, even entering combat exhausted, it could totally be worth an additional resource to keep. And, of course, it goes without saying that Warlock Destructor is a perfect target for Gift of Isha. This card isn't meant to be played far down the line of planets, intended to win you command and meant to endure, but rather I think it's much better served to tar pit your opponent in round after round of grueling combat, hopefully managing to kill off far more resources and cards worth of enemy requisitions than this unit itself cost you to deploy. This unit is extremely cheap and stunningly effective, and while it's certainly worth noting that at present its trait doesn't happen to possess any available synergy, it's only a matter of time and war packs before that ends up changing entirely. So this is a unit not without some downside, but definitely one that warrants the tiniest bit of risk. Played poorly, this could cost you a large number of resources, but when thrust into combat early and often, I can think of scarcely few cards more cost-efficient than the Warlock Destructor. But last, as the ultimate card of our war pack, we see the Eldar Foretell. It's a zero-cost event with one shield icon and the power and maneuver traits. It reads Interrupt. When a battle ability triggers, exhaust your Warlord to cancel its effects. Then draw one card. So this is an interesting event. Note that in order to potentially benefit from this effect, you need exhaust your Warlord, which means you could potentially leave yourself exposed. If you want to cancel a battle ability at a planet earlier in line than was commit your Warlord, you'll be foregoing the opportunity to act with that unit in order to essentially nullify that ability. So, even though you give up your chance to retreat until the end of the first combat round at that planet, which means you potentially abandon your chance to snipe an enemy unit, you could nevertheless incur considerable benefit in opting to do so. By canceling Taurus, for instance, you could deprive your opponent of the opportunity to draw 3 cards or generate 3 additional resource tokens, and by negating perhaps Farron or Planum, you could either prevent the rout of one of your most valuable units, or simply stop your opponent from moving a powerhouse combatant, for instance from Planet 1 to Planet 2, which would mean it would be ready during combat the following round, as opposed to arriving from the enemy HQ exhausted. Since your possession of Foretell in hand will generally be difficult to predict for your opponent, it's entirely possible you could convince them to overcommit to winning a planet only to prevent them from benefiting from its associated battle ability at the last possible moment. And even though your Warlord may be exhausted, if he or she is the only unit sitting at a planet, you will still get to activate your own battle ability. And I definitely think it's worth noting that, regardless as to whether you benefit tremendously from including a copy or 2 of this event in your deck, when you do play this card, it effectively cantrips, that is, replaces itself in your hand. So, apart from leaving you potentially exposed, for instance, if your opponent decides to punish your exhausted Warlord with Infernal Gateway or Drop Pod Assault, this card costs you no more than a mere slot in your deck and can easily save you from a potentially game-altering combo. I think this event is particularly great when played by a Warlord that doesn't necessarily need to participate during battle, such as the 1 attack value Commander Shadowsun or Eldorath Starbane, but even in the hands of a Warlord like Packmaster Kith or either of our Space Marines, this event can be powerfully versatile. Note that it's possible you may not be able to use this ability. For instance, if your Warlord is upstream of your enemy and ends a combat having retreated or having been otherwise exhausted, but it still provides a significant bit of power and versatility. So, not exactly an obvious powerhouse, but definitely an event that provides disaster insurance and which lets you commit your Warlord more flexibly, as well as something that affords you the opportunity to often enough take somewhat bigger risks during combat. But now that we've introduced each and every new card introduced within the Gift of the Ethereals War Pack, I'd like to thank you once again for watching. We've seen not only our first 3 Warlord Cycle Warlords in previous videos, but have now also discussed our first 3 full expansion packs as well. What are your own thoughts, opinions, and perspective regarding the contents of the Gift of the Ethereals? What are some of your best and worst play experiences with any or all of these cards, and how has the Gift of Ethereals held up with time as the third of our war packs? Please let me know in the comments, because with your input, these videos stand only to become all the better resources for players, both novice and veteran alike. But thank thank you once again for watching, and if you enjoyed this content, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're always encouraged to share this content, as the more likes, the more views these videos receive. All of it means more players are more likely to be exposed to Conquest. They may give the game a try, like what they experience, end up joining our community, and of course, all together we send the message to Fantasy Flight Games to continue to support this fantastic product. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, I would encourage you to do so through Facebook or on Twitter, and if at any point you feel so inclined to donate to help support the Hive Tyrant, I would be honored were you to contribute to my Patreon. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.